Carla Weinshank for the Daily Music Break. I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to spend a few minutes chatting with Denny Tedesco. Denny is a movie maker, and he had directed a movie in 2008 called The Wrecking Crew. Denny's experience with the Wrecking Crew is a very natural one because his dad, Tommy Tedesco, was one of the stalwarts of that legendary group, using the word generically. It wasn't really a musical group as we refer to them, but of that collective of musicians. And if you haven't heard of the Wrecking Crew, you're in for quite a treat because it's really a pretty amazing story. So welcome, Danny. Again, thank you very, very, very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate it.
So to start with, for those who might not be initiated, could you describe exactly what the Wrecking Crew was?
Yeah, Wrecking Crew, like you said, is just a term, but it goes back to a group of session musicians in Los Angeles in the early 60s who basically were session musicians that were playing the rock and roll stuff or the pop music stuff that the the more legit studio musicians didn't want to do because there was so much work going on, but a lot of the guys didn't want to take a chance on a Phil Spector date or a Beach Boys date or any other dates because it was rock and roll and it was beneath a lot of those guys. So these guys that started doing rock and roll or doing these dates, they started doing, Phil Spector. They started doing Mamas and Papas. They did the Beach Boys, Janet Dean, Frank Sinatra, Nancy Sinatra, Tommy Rowe. I mean, it just never stopped. The Byrds. And what it was once they started going into the studio, they became in demand. And they just wrapped the town up with, no one would hire anybody but this group of loosely knit musicians. There was about, 10, 15, 20. No one, you can never say who's in it. I would say there's a core group. Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer were the drummers that were doing it all the time. Bass players, there was Joe Osborne. There was Carol Kay was the only woman. There was Lyle Ritz, Chuck Berghofer. Piano, there was Don Randy, Mike Melvoin, Leon Russell. He was a session musician in the early days. Glenn Campbell on guitar. He was a session guitar player. My father, Tommy Tedesco, Barney Kessel and Howard Roberts, straight ahead jazz guys, but didn't have a problem playing rock and roll. And Bill Pittman and other gentlemen. But basically that's what it was. And they just kept going and they were going around the clock for years, never stopping until the train slowly came to a halt in the late 60s.
It's funny, when I was preparing for this, I looked up, first of all, I want to say, not just because I'm interviewing you, your movie was just great. And thank you. I'm going to get back to why I think I'm going to get back in a little while to why I think it was probably a huge challenge. But that's for a little bit later. I started, and you probably know what I'm going to say. I started compiling a list of famous, well-known songs that the Wrecking Crew is involved in, and I just kind of gave up. I mean, it's almost to the point of being ridiculous.
Is because of all the music that they did became the issue of why the film took many years in the making. First of all, let me just basically, in 96, I started this when my father, Tommy, was diagnosed with cancer. And it was terminal cancer. They said, no, he's maybe got a year. And that kind of like threw me because it was like, well, I thought about one day making a movie about this. And I said, well, I better do it. And I got my friends, because I was in film, but I wasn't a director. And I got my friends to help me. And we basically did a round table and started with Carol, my father, Hal Blaine, and Plas Johnson. When I made this, Dad passed away the next year, and all I had was 14 minutes of a cut of what it could feel like. And I had like maybe 50 songs in those 14 minutes. And everybody kept saying, you'll never get this made. They said, you'll never get the music labels to come together to help you. And you're never going to get someone to invest when it's only going to make this much and it's going to cost you this much.
Right.
So people would come up with all kinds of ideas. They said, when I cut the song, I finally cut the movie later, I'll come back to that, but I cut the movie, I have 110 songs in the movie, 110. Every one of those songs has one of these players on it. It does, even if it's not a hit, it could have been some of their own material that they did on their own solo albums.
Right.
But 110 songs, and I promise you, you know 100 of them. When people would say, why don't you just use 20 songs? That was like, all right. They didn't get it because the thing about the Wrecking Crew, they were going around the clock, but it wasn't always quality. When I say that tongue in cheek, but it was true. They were hired guns, and they went in, they got out. So sometimes so I said, I have to show quantity and not so much always the quality. So in the opening, if you remember the opening of the movie, you have Frank Sinatra next to Chipmunks. Because the Chipmunks, the Sinatra, the Beach Boys, Herb Alpert, Tommy Rowe, you know, I mean, all these songs, but you had to show the quantity. That's what this was. If I played you a Supreme song, Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, and Jackson 5, what do you know? It's Motown. But you can't tell me what's the correlation between Beach Boys, Sinatra, and Monkees, and the Chipmunks. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. So that's what I had to go for. So some of the songs, we had Gary Lewis these are the artists. Gary Lewis and the Playboys, This Diamond Ring, La Bamba, Richie Valens, Fifth Dimension, Stone Soul Picnic, all the Fifth Dimension stuff, Up, Up and Away, Jan and Dean. You had, Little Lady from Pasadena, California Dreamin', Good Vibrations, Herb Alpert, all of her, can't even name them. The Boots Were Made for Walking. The print is so small. Okay, so you can't even see it. But, like I said, there's 110 songs. The Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man.
You have Simon.
It just went on and on.
Yeah, you have you have the Glenn Campbell stuff, Wichita Lineman,
Galveston, Mrs. Robinson,
Mrs. Robinson. So, it's an amazing story. So, was it a case after a while that they had kind of the town so sewn up that if they were involved, it may not be on their skill as musicians, which obviously is amazing. But were they, if you were a band, were you like dying to have the Wrecking Crew involved because they were so known? I mean, did it work both ways?
I don't know. No, not the bands themselves. I mean, I think it was a business. And the thing is, especially in the early days, in the 60s, a lot of singers, like let's just say Phil Spector stuff. Well, Riots have a band, so, they'd probably at the time. These guys had the skills of being in a studio. They only had mono, so they were doing one track. So they would go, they were 8, and they only had 3 hours per recording session because it was a union gig. You could only do 3 songs or 4 songs within those 3 hours. Right. That's what the union wanted. They didn't want you to knock out 2 albums in 3 hours. If they could just record. Right. Bands probably at the time, some of them were upset. The Byrds, a great example. Terry Melcher was the producer, and Terry Melcher was working for Columbia, and he had the job of going in with his band, the Byrds. Great band, great guys, good musicians, but they weren't studio musicians. Thank you. They were great musicians. So Terry Melcher has the job of going into the studio to do the Byrds. So he decides, I'm going to bring in, with Roger McGuinn, only Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, I'm going to put Leon Russell, Hal Blaine, Bill Pittman, Jerry Cole, and on guitars. I think it was Larry Knechtel on bass. And he decides to put them into the studio. Byrds were extremely upset about this. You know, they want to play on their own album.
Right.
So, but he knows, Terry Melcher knows, I only have 3 hours. If I don't have a hit or come close, we don't have an album. So he has to, you know, basically that's his job, is to keep going. Once they got the hit, then the band comes in and does the rest of the songs. As Roger McGuinn said, those guys did the A side and the B side of Tambourine Man. And in those 3 hours, they did that. When they did Turn, 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 another #1 hit with the Byrds, it took 77 takes. Now, it doesn't mean that the Byrds can't play. It's just a different techniques at the time. They didn't have the luxury of taking their time like today or later in the 70s. So the bands weren't always happy about it, but in the end, Leland Sklar told me, you know, Leland, the great bass player, one of the greatest in the world, he was one of the guys that had his instrument taken from him in the late 60s. Mike Post was producing this band that he was in. And he says today, he says, I looked in from the studio and watched these guys do it. You know, all these guys are playing, you know, the instruments for their band. And he realized we couldn't have done that. You know, they were great. I mean, Leland is one of the greatest musicians in the world, but he didn't have that skill at that moment to go in and knock off reading and whatever it was. And, but that soon changed.
Right. There was a special relationship with the Beach Boys and with Phil Spector. And if you could address each of those, that would be great. Now, the Beach Boys worked with the Wrecking Crew on Pet Sounds, which is one of the most important albums in the whole rock and roll world. I mean, it's right up there with Sgt. Pepper, and anything that's up there with Sgt. Pepper is special.
Yeah.
And that was a close relationship. And Phil Spector with the Wall of Sound. So if you could take each of those, it would be great.
Sure.
Denny.
Well, with how Brian got turned on to the studio musicians, it was Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean told me, when Dean and Jan and Dean were doing one of those hootenannies, or, you know, the concerts where they would do 4 songs, Beach Boys would do, you know, 4 songs or whatever. And they became friends on this concert that they did. And at that time, Jan and Dean weren't really doing, they were doing more doo-wop. They weren't really doing beach stuff. And they started talking to each other, became friends. And they took one, you know, Brian's song, Surf City, if I'm correct. I could be wrong. My mind loses it sometimes. But they took that song and it became their song. And they brought Brian in to, you know, maybe sing some backgrounds and stuff. But that's when they turned Brian on to all the musicians, because it was Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer on drums. And they had all studio musicians. And that was, I think, supposedly Dean said it was the first time he saw how they made their record with studio musicians. And they kind of turned Brian on to that. Well, Brian also is a huge fan at that point of Phil Spector, you know, huge fan. And Be My Baby was like the greatest song for him ever, you know. So he realized these are the same musicians, and they all knew each other. And Hal was being brought in, as well as Ray Pullman, the bass player, to do some Beach Boys songs in the early days, as well as another drummer named Frankie DeVito did one of the songs. And so these guys would basically, Hal and Ray would do the songs. And then when Brian started having his, you know, unfortunately the meltdown, he didn't want to go on the road anymore. So he stayed in and started writing. Well, he decided to use the studio musicians all the way through Pet Sounds, because as Al Jardine said, we were coming off the road and we were exhausted. And he said it would have taken us a long, long time before we could have done what Brian wanted on Pet Sounds. And, you know, some of the times it was really simple, it was in Brian's head. You know, some of the things the guys are playing is not so much, it's so complex. It's not maybe for each of those instruments, but what Brian's doing with it, how Brian's hearing it, is a totally different thing.
Right.
And I don't think Brian would have ever had the respect from his brothers and his cousins to sit to do that. You know, like any relationship in family, you do, you know, if you do a freebie for your family, you know, they want in and they want out.
Right.
But these guys are getting paid. They'll be there as long as you want. They could take months,
Right.
you know, and there was a respect for Brian. They loved Brian, the musicians.
Right.
I think they looked at him as their little brother who was like, and I think a lot of the respect came much later when I say that, once they heard a mix. Right. Once they heard the song put together, I think it became a whole different thing.
Mm-hmm. And what, real briefly, for people who might not be as up on this stuff as other people, what was the Wall of Sound, and how did the Wrecking Crew participate?
The Wall of Sound? That was another term that came, I think, later. I don't know if they called it at the time. Might have been precedented. Basically, Wall of Sound was, Phil Spector brought all the musicians into Gold Star. Gold Star, oh God, I would say maybe it was, oh God, it can't be more than maybe 50 feet by 40 feet. I can't even imagine. Wasn't that big. So you had drums and 4 guitars, you had 3 or 4 pianos. It was just, I mean, there was no room. Right. And so in those days, you only had, again, we're talking about, if you mic all those people in that room, you got to send it to the board, and you're basically bringing it to a board, and it's only going to have one mic or one track to put it on. So all that, there was no baffles, so it was kind of all bleeding together. It was like a wall of sound. Right. And he was able to, and Larry Levine, who was the engineer, was able to basically, you know, just control it somehow. They were, but also Phil and superstitious about certain things. You didn't, God help you if you touched a mic. You know, he would sit there and he would just do like little touch, just a hair. It's like, really? Is that going to make a difference? But, you know, that was his thing. There was one point we had 4 guitar players, and Larry said, "Hey, Phil, why don't you dump a guitar player, because I don't have any. I've mic'd everybody. I'm out of mics. I got nowhere to plug into." Mm-hmm. And he said, "No, leave him. I want him to stay there. His body is making sound," meaning like it's created the buffer. It's like, well, whatever, you know. So that's how much, you know, he believed in it.
Talk a little bit on a more personal level, I guess, about where your dad fit into all this. And I have a follow-up question to that.
The weirdest thing is my mom and dad grew up in Niagara Falls, New York. You know, they were both from like poor Italian families. They were not, you know, dad was not even a wannabe musician. I mean, he wanted to be a musician, but it wasn't like a goal in his life. In 1953, he went to a dance and with my mom, and the big band was losing its guitar player. Someone told him. They said, "Hey, I told my friend that I got a friend that plays guitar. You want to audition?" And so sure, he went to audition that night after the dance. It was the Ralph Martiri band, and he got the job, and he went on the road. And he went on the road for like a couple months, and then he got to L.A. and he saw L.A. and what was going on. Right. And then they let him know that, hey, in 2 weeks you're going to be gone, because we found a guitar player that can sing, so we're dumping you and they can sing it. So it was like, great, you know. Yeah, right. Even in music, they, you know, they cut you out. Right. So he was too ashamed to go back home. And he went back and said to my mom, I said, "I want to move to Los Angeles. There's music, people making, you know, money playing music." And I asked my mom, I said, and they did it. I said 2 things. I said, "How long was it before you left?" She goes, "We left in 3 weeks." Mm-hmm. He was so ashamed of being fired on the road. He didn't want to stay. Right. So that was it. I said, was he working a lot in Niagara Falls? She goes, "There was no music in Niagara Falls. Right. A party or a wedding maybe." Right. So I don't think he would have ever had the initiative or to do it.
Right.
It wasn't part of his thing. So he gets to LA and he struggles for the first few years, but he practiced 8, 10 hours a day, getting his skills up, learning how to read.
You know, I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but what I saw of his playing in the movies just, you know, just amazing. I mean, what was that little instrument he was playing at one point? Was it is it a
Oh, the
mandolin?
mandolin.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
he's
just,
blazing,
and
flying across it.
he's also very funny. I mean, I was watching his movies. I'm interviewing you, and
Yeah.
I'm laughing because, you know, he's telling these stories. So
He was a very funny, yeah.
very
He
charismatic.
was
He
very
went on the
charismatic. He
Gong
was a down
Show,
to earth guy.
right?
What's that?
He went on the Gong Show. I mean, you know,
Yeah,
in a
he
tutu,
did that as a dare. He
right?
did that as a dare, and nobody knew that he was doing it.
Right,
He goes on the Gong Show dressed as a 280-pound ballerina with a guitar,
right.
and he won. And
I hope he got
but
something
it was,
good. I hope he got something good.
well, he
Um,
always said he would tell he would tell the story of how he parlayed it into multiple earnings. He said, the shower massage, I got the $432 for the win, and I wrote the song, so I got my BMI payments for that. And he says I parlayed it into one big day. So, but I mean, he was the greatest thing about for me on this doc is the things that you don't see where there's all these musicians would tell me stories,
right,
and yeah, they tell you stories about his abilities. Were phenomenal when it came to reading music and playing the classical guitar, the acoustic guitar, not so much classical playing. But it was always the stories about him as a person, of
mhm,
what he did for them. And those obviously I didn't put it wasn't about him in the
right.
movie, but those were the ones that stay with me today.
Yeah, and you knew he was a great player, and I'm sure, you know, when I hear good stuff about my parents, that means more than their, you know, physical accomplishments in the world. Now
Right.
you grew up with this stuff, and then you revisited it as a grown up, making a movie. What did you learn
Yeah.
about the whole era, and
Well,
when you compare it to
right.
your experience growing up?
All right. Well, here's the thing. People assume it was a hootenanny at
Mhm.
home. I'm born in 61. I'm born in the 60s. So as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s,
Right,
people assume it was like a jam session. I
right,
never saw my father pick up his guitar and play guitar until 1975, 76,
right,
because dad went to work every day like every other dad.
right,
Instead of in the trunk, he didn't have a drill and a saw or a hammer. He
right,
had the Telecaster, a classical, acoustic, 12-string, a mandolin, an amp, or whatever. And that was
mhm,
it.
right,
And those instruments went to work with him every day.
right,
I knew dad went to work as a guitar player, but I didn't understand it.
right.
It hit me until maybe when the Partridge Family album came out and friends said, "Oh, your dad's on the Partridge Family album."
So,
That's when I realized, oh, my dad's special.
yeah,
He had done all this other stuff all the way before that,
I,
but Partridge Family made more
I don't know if it was
effect.
directly in association with the record crew, but could you tell us some of the TV theme songs that he played on?
Sure.
There,
Well, he did because see, the thing about my father, we talk about his reading, he was extremely in demand, and that's why his career went so well.
right,
From TV, he did records in the early days, in the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, he went into TV and film, and
right,
from that point on, all the way. But in TV, he was the lead guitar on Batman, Green Acres, um,
Twilight Zone.
Three's Company. No, he didn't do Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone it's funny. He did the movie Twilight Zone, so that's where people get it. They
Right,
give him credit for that. He never did it, but what he found out was Twilight Zone. The original score of that was from some French composition or from some piece of music in France that they basically probably stole
right,
and used it in the series.
right.
So he never did that, but he did the movie Bonanza. Like I said, Three's Company, that awful Wawa he used to say.
Yeah, and MASH, right?
MASH. Yeah, the opening, the guitar, and MASH.
Suicide is easy.
Yeah. Or Painless.
Painless, right? I'll have to edit that out. I'll edit out my mistake. It's funny with the Twilight Zone, it would have been two upstate New York boys because I think Serling was from either Binghamton or Schenectady. So that's what's
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, one of those upstate towns. I spent time upstate. When I was going through this and I was preparing for it, I noticed that the Wrecking Crew had no credits from after a certain year until 2015, where they get credit on Glenn Campbell's "I'm Not Gonna Miss You," and I'm not gonna miss you. I only watch. It's such a sad song. I only watched it once.
Yeah.
It's the story of
It's
dementia.
an amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing video, and it's really hard to watch. It's video of Glenn Campbell with his family, and the idea of the song
Great
is,
documentary.
he's not going to be there. He's going to be mentally gone, and everyone else has to suffer the loss. But I saw the Wrecking Crew got credit on that. Is there a backstory there? Did the guys get back together?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, it's funny. To go back a little further to 2000s, I think it was 2002, 3, I did my interview with Glenn, and I went to Phoenix to do that. And during the interview, it was great interview, fabulous interview. But there were moments where it was like, well, what's going on? Because it was like I'd ask a question and he'd give me the same answer that he gave me the question before or two questions before.
Right.
And it felt like dementia. Didn't realize it was Alzheimer's at the time. But then he would kick in, and I mean the stories are phenomenal.
Right.
And he was so happy to talk about it because those were his favorite times. And he talked about not being the leader and being the side guy. That's what made it so special.
Right.
So years later, when they brought Hal, Joe Osborne, and Don Randy into the studio to do that song, and Glenn singing, it was really sad for the guys because they knew they were close.
Right.
And I don't think sometimes they knew him, or sometimes he would know them, and some probably not. But God, it's the most heart-wrenching song. So really, that was their last #1 hit in a sense.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's really, I only watched it once. It was a little bit. I went through that thing with my mom, and it's very, very hard. What I wanted to say when I was talking about what really impressed me about the movie, there's so many songs, so many famous performers, so many musicians with interesting backstories, and so much going on. I was just thinking, how did he and it's well organized to tell the story. It must have been, what I was thinking is, it must have been a tremendously difficult thing just to organize all that material in a cogent way.
It's really interesting that you said that. Like I said, it started in '96. After 10 years, all I had was a bunch of interviews because no one would help us. So basically, I did everything wrong. I used my credit card, I refinanced, I did all those bad things you're not supposed to do. And I basically figured, if I don't cut this, I don't have a film. I've just wasted a lot of time and money. And it's like having a property overlooking a beautiful beach, and you got the plans for the house, you already have the plans, you got the lumber, you got everything, the appliances, but unless you build it, you can't sell it or show it.
Right.
So I did this, basically made a cut, started in 2006, got into festivals in '08, but I still couldn't get it off the ground because of no one would help. It wasn't until 2015 did we actually release the film. But over those years, when we started cutting, she says, you got to stop interviewing people because we can't put everybody in this.
Right.
And I said, I totally get it. I said, but this is why God gave us DVDs.
Right.
I said, and I jokingly said this, but the truth was, I didn't know, what if I interview so-and-so and he gives me some kind of big, huge bomb of a story. It's like, oh my God, I had no idea. Right. Unless I'm final cut, I still want, and also I want to give everybody a chance to tell their story. Right. There's so many people that I interviewed that are not in the movie. And they're only on the DVD. There's, right. I don't know if you have the DVD. It's 6 hours of bonus material. Okay. And I'm so happy that Magnolia allowed us to do that. It's 2 CDs worth or DVDs worth. It right. meant so much to me to have everybody tell their story. Yeah. When the other, real quick, was the other thing that you probably didn't realize was when we had 20 minutes cut, it was nothing. I was never going to be in it. I was never going to have my voice in it. I didn't want to be known to be the son right. of Tommy Tedesco. And my friend, who's an editor and a director, said, "Why are you guys cutting it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're cutting it, and you're the only one that can tell the story in a certain way that none of us could ever tell this right. story. Right. You're cutting a History Channel story." I said, "Well, I don't want to." And the truth was, I didn't want to do that because my ego was saying, "Oh, then you're the son. You're not going to be the director." Right. And that was killing me because I wanted to be, I am, a filmmaker. Right. And I knew that it might take me down a road, but I realized it worked. Right. It helped me edit. And we had so many, storylines that didn't work out. And the only way we decided, if it doesn't come back to the people, the musicians, we got to cut it. Right. So you lose your children, the babies that you love. I think
you made the right choice. I mean, you are part of the story. I mean, you are part of the story.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, I saw a lot of clips on YouTube. I watched the movie on YouTube, but I saw a lot of clips before, and you probably can't tell it now, but the Cher story about Leon Russell was probably the funniest.
I love it.
Yeah, and
I love that story. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, what's amazing in the movie is seeing her as a little kid. I mean, what was she, 15, 16 years old in the movie?
15, 17, yeah.
And Leon Russell is one of my favorite people from the whole.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny, my two favorite keyboard players are Dr. John and Leon Russell. I guess Duke Ellington too. They were both in the Wrecking Crew. I was just going to ask you how people can get the DVD. Is it an Amazon link, or is there?
Yeah, it's an Amazon, or they could. You know what? Amazon. With Amazon, we don't know what we ever get. I don't know if we get anything. But if you go to my website, wreckingcrewfilm.com, mm-hmm. and use the word "thank you," mm-hmm. As a discount, they'll get a discount on anything. There's books there. There's the DVDs. There's CDs. There's, I don't know if you can see this. Can't with the green screen behind it. But you got soundtracks. They could do that. And, if you don't mind, if I just want to talk about the next project that I'm doing.
Please,
which kind of relates to this.
Yeah.
So I was pretty much shell-shocked after the film came out in 2015, because of 20 years in making. You killed me. But and people would come up with ideas. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And it's like, I don't want to talk about music at that point. It was like, forget it. I said, I used to threaten my next film is about a solo triangle player. All he plays is one thing, a triangle, and that's it. No publishing, nothing. I don't have to license anything. But so then someone came to me last year and said, "Listen, would you be interested in a documentary on the section?" And I said, talking about Danny Kuchmar and Waddy, or not Waddy, but Russ Kunkel and Leland Sklar. And he said, "Yeah." I said, "They have a band called Immediate Family." I thought, oh, okay. And I started thinking about it, because at the end of the Wrecking Crew, Wrecking Crew ends in 60, kind of like 67, 68 's their heyday. But it starts dwindling very fast. The music changed, the production changed, music changed, the business changed. Rock and roll had its own bands. You didn't need session musicians like this anymore. I interviewed Mike Post the other day, the great composer. You know, he does all the TV work, and he played with the Wrecking Crew. And he said, those Wrecking Crew guys, he said, they were gunslingers. They went in 3 hours, nailed it, move on to the next 3 hours, boom, boom, boom. 3 or 4 times a day. Those guys were gunslingers. They had stuff thrown at them, they did it, boom, 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 boom. The business changed, and now the singer-songwriters are coming in. They're bringing their own people in. Carole King's bringing in Danny. She's bringing in Russ, and James Taylor's bringing in Danny and Russ and Leland, and then Linda, Wally, and all those guys are all coming together. They're spending time together in the studio making albums, but they're taking, you know, weeks and months.
Right.
So this film is called Immediate Family because they have a band called Immediate Family. And I said, well, that's the spin on it. The fact that after 50 years of playing together, these guys are still together, the greatest musicians in the world, but the relationships are tight, really tight, and with the artist. So my dad didn't hang out with Brian, you know, or Frank, you know, that wasn't what we did. You know, Dad went to work and that was it.
Right.
These guys went on after they do an album, they went on the road with them. Right. So Running on Empty with Jackson Browne, do the album, do the warm up at the concert, and then they play with Jackson. I mean, talk about tight at the end of that summer. And that's what this film's about, is about family and these singer-songwriter musicians, not them. So I've interviewed Carole King, and
no, I'm just going to ask you, when is it?
We started it last year, and COVID stopped us in our tracks, and we're back in the running. So I'm hoping early next year. Like I said, I interviewed Carole King, Linda Ronstadt, James Taylor, Jackson Browne, Phil Collins, Lou Adler, and it just hasn't stopped. And it's going to be so much fun. It's fun because it is a jump off of the Wrecking Crew. Mm-hmm. You know,
in a sense, you're telling the story backwards because it's now.
People go, oh, they assume I know so much. I don't know shit. I don't know crap. You could, bleep it out. But I've learned so much. You know, I continue to learn. And it's so exciting for me because I get excited to go. Right. I realized when I was interviewing Peter Asher, the great producer, and he brought, James Taylor into to Apple, and he started James's career, and he used all these session musicians. And he said to me, no, he goes, those guys weren't session musicians until I brought them in. And I realized, oh yeah, I keep thinking they're legends. There are legends, but they're not legends in 1972.
Right. Well, you must be doing something right because you didn't get interviews with Carole King, James Taylor because your father was in the Wrecking Crew. That's not how it works. You got those interviews because you've proven,
Yeah. I mean, the band, the guys needed, when they realized, this is the great thing, one of the great compliments I got from one of the musicians. He said, because I was saying, I don't know, I'm not a musician. I don't know this stuff. I really don't. Right. I know what, who played on things or this and that. I'm not a musician. He says, yeah, but you're not a civilian.
Right.
And I knew what he meant. Right. I know what makes those guys tick. I knew why. That's why Wrecking Crew did so well. Not because of me so much, is they were able to give their honest opinions.
Right.
And I know what made my father tick.
Right.
And that to me is more interesting than the solo.
It's a very compelling story. And I actually will post these songs, the names of a lot of the songs when I, write a post to accompany the video, the interview. It's been great. I thank you very, 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 very much, Denny Tedesco.
And thank you. And I was going to say, if they are joining the Facebook pages because there's so much trivia on there. That's where you get a lot of fun. Is the Wrecking Crew Film Facebook page and the Immediate Family Film Facebook page. And there's so much information there that we keep sharing and finding out. I can't thank you enough, Carl, for keeping it alive.
I appreciate it. I will post those URLs with the article. So this is Carl Weinshank for the Daily Music Break. Thanking Denny Tedesco very, very much for his time and just really fascinating, fascinating conversation about the Wrecking Crew, about his father, about a great era in music that is gone, but still, since they have video, it lives on. Thank you.